happy to have Reena. I found her online and was so impressed with the work she was doing. I love her focus on intersectionality. And, you know, as everyone knows, we're trying to incorporate a lot more cultural diversity, different points of view, and really incorporate what we can learn from our shared experiences. We had Jules Edwards last week, who's an Ojibwe woman who had amazing things to say about her culture, her experiences, and different views of neuroexpansivity, which were very positive. And so this has been one of the months I've looked forward to the most with her, and then Reena coming today. So yeah, Reena, take it away and run things however is comfortable for you. I look forward to it.
No pressure, Dawn. I've been looking forward to this. I hope it delivers. I have to admit, when Dawn invited me, I did think, what could I possibly share that would be not just useful, but perhaps different than things you already know, because you're already in this space doing lots of work. And I thought, well, the one thing is actually my own story as a parent from the global majority who has 2 neurodivergent children, and some of the cultural aspects around that, which I never had to think about until I had my first autistic child. So I will start with a bit of my own personal story. I'm very conscious that I do use language that is different to language that's used in the US. So I use terms like neurodivergent and neurodiversity, and I know that there are complementary terms. So if there's anything I say that perhaps doesn't sit so well, then I'm absolutely open to hearing that. I like to think that the language is very neuroaffirmative, particularly because I actually train other organizations on how to create that. But I also appreciate that across jurisdictions, it really does vary. And just because something might be, you know, perhaps the language that we use at the moment, because it's also evolving all the time in the UK, that might not necessarily be the case abroad. So it is. I'm hoping this is going to be more of a conversation than just speaking at you, which won't be as interesting. I'm going to put some slides up in a moment, and then there are a few points at which I will invite you to just share any thoughts or opinions if you'd like to, but you don't have to. And if you choose not to share them, you know, through coming off mute, then you're most welcome to put anything in the chat as well.
One thing I just want to ask is if you would mind, if you're not speaking or if you don't intend to say something, please leave yourself on mute. It'll really help with the audio quality. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Yes, I'd forgotten that. And yeah, it is being recorded. So if you're anything like me, I'm a habitual note taker, but at least you can rest assured that Roger's recording this, so you don't have to feel that pressure of having to take reams of notes. And actually, I'd actually invite you to, I guess, digest more than feel like you have to kind of capture it all. Okay, so it is lovely to be with you, and I'd love to just say thank you, a big thank you to Roger and to Dawn for inviting me to join you in conversation today. We're going to go on a bit of a journey together for the next, it won't be an hour because we kind of run, and I always like to respect people's time, but for the next kind of few minutes. And usually this is the part where I'd introduce myself, give you maybe a sneak peek into my background, but I'm going to keep things a bit more exciting and share that as we go through, as I share my story with you. But as I'm sharing the next few slides, you'll get to know who I am and why these topics in particular mean so much to me. So what I will be sharing with you today, you'll experience my journey through an alternative perspective, which touches on the themes of being a parent of an autistic child and an ADHD child from the global majority. I'm going to be focusing on my older son's journey today, and really looking at the impact of culture and how it can shape the experience that we have in society. I'd really just invite you to do a few things. So firstly, as I share my story, don't just hear it about me, but hear it maybe about yourself or perhaps anyone that you might know. And I'd really invite you to be open-minded as I'm speaking and to ask yourself, okay, do I have any blind spots that are coming up for me as I'm hearing these different experiences that Reena's sharing? And is there anything more that, you know, we could learn about? And after the first section, where I just share a bit of my history, I'm going to ask you to share any themes that you have heard coming out of my story. Again, if you don't feel like coming off mute, that's absolutely fine. But please feel free to share any thoughts you have about that, or of any themes that you hear in the chat. So let's rock and roll. So I'm going to tell you a bit about me. So back in 2006, I qualified as a solicitor. So in the US, that's known as an attorney, I believe, after having completed my degree and master's degree in law. And education had been instilled in me from a very, very young age. My father had come to this country from India, and my mum was from Kenya back in the 1970s. My dad had literally a couple of pounds in his pocket and had to work as a petrol pump attendant just to make ends meet. So I guess what you'd call that is like an attendant in a gas station. His name was Jagdish, which means Lord of the World, but his employers at that time had said it was too difficult to say, so they shortened it to Jack, which people actually still call him today. My mum went to night school to learn secretarial skills, and she worked as a personal assistant or secretary. They really struggled financially throughout my childhood, but they were adamant that their children wouldn't experience the same hardship. And how would they do that? Through education. So being academically successful was the only route out of poverty, and that is what was instilled in me from a very, very young age. Be quiet, learn, that was all I had to do. So after practicing as an attorney, I then worked as an ombudsman, which is a quasi-judicial function, so working as an equivalent of a judge in the UK for the British public. So I worked as an ombudsman, which was quite a corporate environment, and there was lots and lots of pressure. I was very much overworked. I had a team double the size I ought to have, whereas some of my peers had no direct reports at all. But my parents' voice resonated in me. Stay focused, uphold the family name. I was, after all, the first child in our family to go to university. And for many reasons, I didn't feel I could assert my rights. I subscribed very much to the model minority stereotype around Asians being obedient, hardworking, and not making a fuss. And I believed in meritocracy. So I thought if I worked hard enough, I'd get what's due to me, despite seeing lesser qualified colleagues who were white literally propelling over the promotion scales, whereas my work was over scrutinized, despite being in the top 5% of performers at the organization. And this fueled my passion for justice and equality. So I headed up the Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic Staff Network, which ended up winning 2 national awards. And I headed up a brand new team dealing with consumer cases involving race and disability discrimination, working with vulnerable consumers, including autistic individuals, victims of abuse, and those who had significant mental health challenges. And during this time, I had my first child. He was born amid huge expectation, both implied and overt, as the son of both an attorney and an eye doctor. People would say to me, my child would be a genius because of us. It was a time of huge celebration because he was the only child on both sides of the family. And he was met with great relief and joy because I had lost my first baby. But he presented very differently. He was quite dominant. He'd tell people where to sit, how to place their hands, how to be. He didn't like other children. He didn't have any friends. He struggled to make eye contact. He seemed not to hear anything I was saying, or it felt like he chose not to listen. He was really sensitive to loud noises. Despite being a very noisy child himself, he never ever expressed hunger. He was a really poor sleeper, taking ages to get to sleep and then waking multiple times in the night. And as he developed, I realized that he couldn't understand or express his or others' feelings. And at that time, what I didn't know was that he had alexithymia. At that time, it felt like all the mums in the parenting circle I was in got the memo on kind of how to parent a child except me. But I refused to consider that Evie could be different in any way, and I was in complete denial. And I blamed the nursery for not seeing that he was a closet genius, for not challenging him enough. I put it down to maybe him being spoiled. And I was convinced that once he was in school, everything would be well. And then, tussling with my emotions and how Evie was presenting, I visited a local drop-in centre at an autism charity locally. And there I met others who talked about differences in their children, but positively. And I wanted to be like that. I didn't want my whole life to dissipate, fearful that my child wasn't subscribing to the standards that I'd placed upon him before he was even born. I wanted to celebrate him, but I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't understand my own child. So it was as if we were speaking two different languages and just getting frustrated at the other for not understanding one another. I also at that time met a life coach, and I confided that I didn't think I could maintain my career and be the mum I wanted to be. But I was scared to leave my job. People from my background didn't do that. I'd lose my status, my salary, my employee benefits, and what would people in my family and my community say about that? So I decided I'd just keep ploughing on, maintaining the pretense of a diligent, unassuming employee who was reliable, hardworking, and could be trusted. And throughout my entire career of being an attorney and then working as an ombudsman, I'd never felt psychologically safe to share what was really going on for me at home. And I was afraid of being judged and seen as less committed or capable of taking on work, and that this would impact my career trajectory. So then, moving on to the period of reckoning, Evie started school and he was struggling to stay in the classroom for a single lesson. He would repeatedly flee when he was emotionally overloaded, and it all came to a head when he was suspended from school at the age of 4.5. So by this point, I'd met several professionals, none of whom understood the internal journey I was going through from a cultural perspective, and none of whom were from a global majority background. And it reached the point when, after amassing all the reports from clinical psychologists, speech therapists, audiologists, occupational therapists, and others, that the only path left was to undertake an autism assessment. There was a 2.5 to 3 year waiting list for that. And I had a child who had actually, had a short-term exclusion from school. I wasn't in the position to wait. Fortunately, my workplace was able to pay for his assessment, and we went ahead. And receiving his diagnosis was super scary for me. I didn't know any other Indian autistic people, and I didn't know how to tell my family about it. I felt guilty, as if it was somehow my fault, and I spent hours Googling what causes autism and mortality and things, which yielded the most horrifying articles. But interestingly, because I presented as a professional person, there was an assumption by the medical staff and all the professionals that I was interacting with that I understood what was going on. But in truth, I was completely lost. My culture had no history of autism. I had no reference point, and there was no translation of the term in my own language. After receiving the diagnosis, I tried to explain it to my family in as lay terms as possible, but it was being mistaken for brain injury or mental illness. They were just not getting it right. And having worked extensively with parent groups, I've seen that many parents face shame, lack of understanding, and become isolated, and often stop going to community places or places of worship. And this was also borne out in national research undertaken in the US. And all of this can lead to mental health struggles for parents, because parenting a neurodivergent child can be really difficult with no support or outlet, or space for self-care. I sought support from my friends, especially friends whose children were also neurodivergent or who had other disabilities, but not my family. And that was really a juxtaposition to how I'd been raised, where family were the first point of support for everything. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that as we kind of progress through the session today. But just to give you some examples, when we got Evie's diagnosis, the leading charity in the United Kingdom is the National Autistic Society. My husband wanted to do something to raise some funds, so he decided to do a half marathon and raise funds for the National Autistic Society. And when he shared this with his family, his mum said, "We will happily support you, but please don't put it on Facebook, because then people will know that Evie's autistic." There was a real sense of, we keep this within ourselves, we don't want people to know. And that was a very uncomfortable conversation to have. You know, even culturally, I'd go to weddings and events and people would just offer unsolicited advice to me, such as, oh, reduce his hyperactivity by massaging his head, or I'm really sorry to hear that your child's autistic, or it must be his previous karma, because being Hindu, we do believe in reincarnation and, you know, the impact of actions in your former life impacting your current life and things like that, and how good deeds, you know, preempt good deeds, etc. Or being told that I should just pray more and that maybe Evie's autism would go away. And this was a real period of testing for my faith and really questioning what was going on. And I realized that actually I was quite stuck in victimhood at that time, and I had to make some very important decisions about what I wanted to do. Trying to understand Evie was really challenging amongst that kind of landscape where I didn't feel I could share what was going on. One day he'd be fine with a toasted cheese sandwich, and the next he would absolutely scream if the cheese had melted on his pasta. And, you know, there are so many factors which impact how a parent receives and processes their child's diagnosis, including how they and their child are perceived by their wider family and community, their interactions with the school and local authority, or in your case, you might call them like your county authorities, the local government bodies that support your areas, and also what people's religious beliefs say about disability, which is something, again, I'll talk about later, but also how success is viewed by different ethnic communities and how disability can often feel like a threat in collectivist cultures. People place a lot of weight on carrying the family name and contributing to the family history and the culture. And for many families, having a neurodivergent child can also create parental conflict within the home, because one partner might be in denial and refuse to adapt their parenting style, where, you know, some parents opting for further castigation to elicit their child's compliance, whereas others are wanting to be more neuroaffirmative in their parenting style. And these disparate parenting styles can really lead to resentment in marriages and relationships. And I can certainly confirm that through all the research and the work that I've done with the parents in the communities here, that is very, very much a live issue that I'm hearing about across the different intersections of society and amongst global majority families. But I started to expand my world by learning the language of autism and neurodiversity. I started to write about my autism journey publicly as a parent, and my blogs were read in 65 countries across the world. And the more I researched, the more I found that global majority autistic children fare worse over their lifespan in terms of their health. They're more likely to die sooner. In terms of their education, the intervention and support that they need is instituted later. And in terms of work, only 22% of people in the UK are in work, but the data is not stratified by race and ethnicity. So there is no data that tells us what that looks like. But what we do know is that they are overrepresented in psychiatric institutions and in the criminal justice system too. But I was not going to let this be the story for me and for Evie. The focus for me was his emotional well-being and meeting his sensory needs. I knew that if we could help him feel psychologically safe, it would reduce his fight and flight reactions. So I worked really closely with the school, using social stories and lots of other techniques to help him feel psychologically safe at school. And I would talk to him daily about his day, even if I didn't know how much he was taking in. I'd read to him. I would be learning and applying different strategies all the time for praising and modeling behavior, not focusing on outcome, but on the effort that he put into things. He required speech therapy and had intensive speech therapy for about 18 months, but we made it super fun and treated and just wove it into our daily life rather than make it feel like work that had to happen. And I was really upfront and advocating for him about the adjustments that he needed when we would go out. He would struggle with queuing, and I would go and explain that this was not something, you know, that he would become very dysregulated if he was forced to stay in a long queue. I would ask for aisle seats if we would go somewhere where that was an issue. I'd always make sure there was space for him to run around, whether that's at weddings or religious functions. And if it meant that I needed to abstain from certain events, then that's what I did. I had to put his needs first. And what I noticed was that when I was confident then there was a reciprocal acceptance of my energy. And I realized that for me to be the parent I wanted to be and needed to be for Evie, I had to confront my own ego and let go of the child that I birthed in my head so I could accept the beautiful one that had been given to me. And this is what led me to freedom and into the advocacy space. The more I noticed and valued Evie's autism as part of his identity, the more I fell madly in love with him. And he is so literal. I once told him he was the apple of my eye, and he was absolutely mortified until I explained what the expression meant. And he mused for a while, and then he retorted, "In that case, Mummy, you're the cucumber of my eyebrow." He remembers everything. And so I learned very quickly only to speak the truth, because otherwise I'd receive a lecture like no other on how lying is a breach of the family rules and how I had let him down. He's really justice oriented. And he embodies every paradox. He notices everything from a repainted door in the neighborhood to the door numbers of every hotel room we've ever stayed at. But ask him to find his shoes when they're in front of him, and he's completely stumped. And fast forward to now, Evie is thriving. He's comfortable in the classroom. He's able to advocate for himself. He's very proud of his autism and will tell people what he needs to be comfortable. He's thriving academically. His true loves in his life are dancing and acting. That's his happy place. So he's forever tap dancing and pirouetting around the house. He's emotionally attuned to his own feelings, and he can now recognize the feelings of others and empathize in a way that is so beautiful. And he loves music. He plays the cello, he plays the piano, and the loveliest thing as well, he's been able to form a small circle of friends whom he absolutely adores and is kind of all in for. So with my newfound awareness and confidence and up-leveled kind of autism-informed parenting approach, it was just time to reevaluate things. And I decided to resign from my job as an attorney, as an ombudsman, and to use my skills to advocate for inclusion and acceptance for global majority autistic and neurodivergent people. And so I started my own consultancy, and this was my rebirth. I used data-backed research to share parenting strategies with global majority parent groups, sharing inclusive teaching practices and governance with schools and education consultants, and working with corporate organisations to realise, access and retain the talent that global majority autistic people bring to the workplace. And so it's my mission and purpose to get these conversations going and to generate awareness and acceptance in society. And as well as the talks and the workshops, I'm involved in various projects, such as one to create digitised culturally sensitive autism assessment tools with the Institute of Child Health in the UK to drive down the waiting lists for assessment, which currently pervades all of the UK, as well as being the trustee on various boards and a peer reviewer for the National Autistic Society's content to look at its cultural applicability. So my journey born out of being Evie's mum really just seeks to bring about positive change, celebrating the talents of autistic and neurodivergent people to create a more equitable society. So as I promised, I'd just love, if anyone wants to share in the chat or if they want to come off mute, what themes did you hear through the story that I just shared with you? And we'll just do that for about 30 seconds to a minute. If anyone wants to share, please feel free to do so.
I would just like to thank you for being the kind of parent you are. I mean, I'm in awe. I love to hear people's stories when they talk about finding the beauty in these situations. The cultural component is obviously very important to me. As an anthropologist and an autistic person, I have watched the numbers grow and grow. 1 in 62, I think it is now, depending on the source. And what we've discovered in this group is that there's clearly autistic culture. Like from around the world, we get each other. We understand how one another think. And but I think we're also cultural disruptors in a very important way. And so kind of what I heard underneath what you were saying is the way that your experience with your son disrupted
Yeah.
some of your cultural assumptions. I think that's really ripe for unpacking.
Yeah, we could do a whole thing on that, and you're absolutely right, Dawn. It's such a perceptive thing you've picked up on. When you're born, and this is something we'll probably cover in a moment, but when you come from a collectivist culture, you inherit a particular way of being. And I only realized how I didn't know who I was until I was forced to have this reckoning, and do this internal excavation, should we call it, when I had Evie, and I had to really question, what beliefs do I have that I want to keep, and which ones am I prepared to let go of, even if those are the beliefs that I've always had and my family have had and their families have had. But and it takes a lot of strength to really look at that, and to advocate when you're in a culture such as I was. And I don't mean to speak for everybody from my own culture, but certainly this is my experience, and I know from many others that when you're a woman, there is a particular way of being that you're expected to be, and one of those is that you don't answer back or even question. And that was not going to align itself with me being Evie's mum. I had to give that up, and I had to speak up and be prepared to walk away. And I think there's so much more we could say on that, but yeah, thank you. That's a really valuable comment. I'll move on then. I can't believe how much time has gone, and I feel like we could just could talk for ages. Right.
Reena, sorry to interrupt. Just
No.
People often go over, so please don't feel like you have to constrain yourself. We're here as long as you have to give us.
That's very kind of you. I always feel like I just always want to honor people's time. So if people have maybe got plans, or I'll keep going. But I will be conscious, shall we say, of the time. But yeah, if it does go over, at least everyone knows they've got the recording. So great. So I love this quote by Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. On the face of it, seems so simply worded, but actually there's so much depth, and it speaks so beautifully to intersectionality. One of the cornerstones of our exploration is the acknowledgement of intersectionality and this intricate interplay between race and neurodiversity. As Dawn just mentioned, and as obviously, as you know, the neurodiverse community is not a homogenous one. It intersects with so many aspects of our identity, and race and ethnicity are just one of those crucial dimensions. And by acknowledging this intersectionality, then we can deepen our understanding of the challenges that are faced by global majority individuals who are also neurodivergent. And this awareness then can allow us to shape a more nuanced, inclusive and responsive neurodiverse culture that recognizes and addresses those unique perspectives and that emerge at the crossroads of race and neurodiversity. And I'm sure you are very familiar with the term intersectionality, so I won't kind of labor this point too much, but just, I guess, to say that, now, I guess the term, from the intention with which it was created by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989, is now much more broad, to really look at not just the way that our different characteristics intersect with one another, but also to go further than that and consider the compounding impact of social categorization, power imbalance, systemic oppression, and the inequitable distribution of resources on people with different marginalized identities. And it can help us to understand, therefore, why certain people's experiences in society differ so much to that of others. And I always feel like you can't talk about intersectionality without a nod to privilege as well, which essentially means the absence of barriers, and that some people enjoy just because they're not disadvantaged, for want of a better word, by particular characteristics. Essentially, privilege is referring to the opportunities and the experience that we have, which is more advantageous than that of others, purely because of particular characteristics we have or because of our background. And you may well have seen this or iterations of this. There are so many iterations of this out in the world. but it's the wheel of power and privilege, and it really can help us to get a more intricate visualization of what the term marginalization can mean. And what essentially you can see is that the further you are from power, the greater the risk of marginalization. And most people will identify with multiple characteristics, and so therefore understanding the impact on people when those characteristics intersect is really important. And ultimately what it kind of tells us is that intersectionality displays many different facets, and there are so many risks associated with not seeing the whole person. But it also helps us to reflect on where are our own biases and our own assumptions about people who are from different cultural and different ethnic groups. And there are, many characteristics and experiences which can add to how people kind of live their life, and how this can create disadvantage beyond what's covered in any anti-discrimination legislation. There's also some shame, there's stigma, there's judgment within families, which when aided by inequalities in society can just further increase the disadvantage that people experience. And whilst I talk about kind of the global majority, I guess it's just important to emphasize that we just can't assume that all people from one particular background experience the same challenges. And actually it's quite dangerous for us to even assume that. And even our level of marginalization and power, is impacted by the environments we're in. So there'll be situations where we will have more power, and situations where we won't. So, because we are people, we're not static dots on a spiky profile. It will always kind of change and vary. But it is important to acknowledge that almost the more layers you have, the more you are on the periphery of the different segments that you see, the more marginalization you're likely to experience in society. And so I've got just a few examples. They are rooted in UK data, but just to highlight kind of intersectionality in practice, as it were. So there was a paper published in 2021 by the University of Cambridge, which looked at prevalence of autism and socioeconomic disadvantage amongst racially diverse groups. And what it found from that paper, that looked at the data of 7 million school children, of whom 120,000 were autistic. And of that population, they found the highest prevalence of autism in Black, Asian, and Chinese children. Data from a different paper from Cambridge also has highlighted that compared to cisgender individuals, transgender and gender diverse individuals have on average higher rates of autism and other neurodevelopmental and psychiatric diagnoses. And there is more recent data as well that's come out which cites in the UK around a third of autistic people are heterosexual. So the majority actually are part of the LGBTQ+ community or identify with that community. This may well be the case in the US too, but certainly in the UK, the most common age for diagnosis for ADHD is actually for women, the late 30s to early 40s, compared to age 7 for boys. And there are lots of reasons for this, but the most kind of stark one, shall we say, for both autism and ADHD diagnoses is that the assessments and the diagnosis models that have been created were done with young white boys in mind, and so they have not been created with cultural responsiveness or cultural sensitivity as part of their design. And further kind of UK research shows that for every, and this is similar to the previous point, but for every woman that's diagnosed with autism, roughly 3 to 6 men are in the UK. So just showing again that it's just harder for women to get those diagnoses. And this was just an extract I wanted to share. This is how stark it was in the Cambridge report I just referenced. When referencing the relationship between receiving special educational needs support, so what you get from schools, and race and ethnicity, non-white pupils were less likely to receive support when compared with white pupils. So there was a real delineation and difference, I guess, between people's cultural and ethnic backgrounds and the likelihood of them receiving support in school. So, and just a quick note really about the power of representation, and I only highlight this to show that, our children are they're going to schools, whether that's mainstream, what we call mainstream schools, or special schools, or other types of hybrid schools, but that the education systems, both in the UK and the US, are heavily led by white professionals. So and also I wanted to just share some exclusion data with you. So in the UK, around 90, as you can see, this is recent data from the Governmental Department for Education, 92.5% of head teachers are white, and 46% of schools in the UK have got no global majority teachers at all in their schools. You have to think about the experience our children from global majority backgrounds who are autistic are having in their education when they're not seeing teachers who look like them, or whom they can identify with. Similarly, in the US, almost 80% of America's 90,000 principals are also white, and you can see the data there for non-white professionals, not professionals, principals, sorry. And also there was a report that highlighted that teachers of colour have increased 162% over the past 30 years, but also they're more likely to quit. And so moving on to just a note on school exclusions, because this is a really big topic in the UK, certainly. Around 5 per 10,000 pupils in the UK, excuse me, are excluded from school. You might use the term suspension, perhaps, in the US, but excluded in the sense of, in the UK, by excluded, I mean permanently. So they're not able to attend mainstream education. They'd have to go to a specialist unit to pursue any further education. And around 12 in 10,000 pupils who are Black are excluded. So you can see the higher proportion of that. What the Department of Education doesn't do, which is one of the things I often kind of complain about when it comes to research, is actually stratify this by diversity and other relevant data. In the US, the odds of being suspended or expelled were 10 times higher for autistic children, and the odds of being suspended or expelled were more than 7.5 times higher for children with developmental delays, as well as 4 times higher for children with speech disorders, and that was data from the US Census bureaus. So the reason it's relevant for me is that school attendance really impacts, so engagement with parents is really important regarding kind of the school journey anyway, but school attendance really impacts the later trajectory of our children. And research does show that missing school has a negative impact on children's academic skills, on their mental health. It increases, the more absence there is in school, it also increases the risk of dropping out of school, and in turn that's also linked to adverse life outcomes such as substance abuse and even mortality rates. So with this, kind of bearing this in mind, the landscape for global majority, looking at the landscape for global majority neurodivergent individuals, there's a recent report, recent as in published in March this year, which showed that in the UK, the turnover intentions for neurodivergent people in the workplace who are from global majority backgrounds was significantly higher compared to the white respondents in that survey. It's the largest survey undertaken in the UK to date around the experience of autism in the workplace. And there's currently no benchmark data. Sorry, I'm going to have to have some water. There is no UK benchmark data on the neurodiversity at work. So there's no kind of best practice or a kind of consensus on what a good neuroaffirmative workplace looks like in the UK at the moment. Where I'm going with this is just that it impacts everything. It impacts, people's lives, their careers, their health, their well-being, their culture, whether they can show up as their true selves, everything. And it's not a problem with society not understanding neurodiversity. It's a combination, I think, of systemic racism in society meeting internalized and institutionalized ableism. And what you can see is that global majority individuals basically have the odds stacked against them because of their identities, multiple identities that they have. So why might autistic presentation differ from people from global majority backgrounds? So there are lots of stereotypes around autism presentation. I'm sure you would come up with a lot more than I could, and certainly richer examples as well. But what doesn't help is things like the stereotype of the Sheldon Coopers, and being sort of very, really studious and really particular in that very overt way, which is not how most global majority autistic people, certainly that I have interacted with and that I've worked with, would subscribe to. And for women, often there's a sense of almost like a loud and proud, very colourful. I often see kind of lots of rainbows, very kind of this is who I am type presentation. And actually, that's not how most Black and Asian women, autistic women I have met, feel is representative of their identity. And actually, there's a lot more that they're carrying with them that means that they don't feel safe to show up as their true selves. As I said, lots of racial stereotypes. I talked about the Muslim minority at the beginning and how it impacted me, and how it made me feel that I couldn't really show up in my workplace and share that I was struggling with little sleep and all of the struggles that I was going through with the school in terms of getting the support that Evie needed, because of this stereotype that I was one of the good ones, one of the ones who would just keep their head down, do the extra work, get the thing done on time, and so on and so forth. And there's lots of research that shows how much worse this experience is also for Black women, who are perceived as being able to tolerate more challenge and more pain, and how this is really underserving of them, and also perpetuates the fact that they can't then show up and share that actually they are struggling, whether that's with their own neurodiversity or with their child, and also being met with disbelief. As I'm sure that the people on the call who can attest, women are also from a very, very early age conditioned socially to be a particular way. And this is certainly very true for people from different, from global majority cultures. And also because of the lack of representation in society and in the media, it really sharpens that focus of you being one of the few, or possibly even the only person in your workplace or in your environment or your social circle who's both from a global majority background and also neurodivergent. And I certainly felt like that when I got Evie's diagnosis, that I was literally the only person in my entire community. It was only when I stepped up and started to advocate that people then felt safe to share with me, and privately, not publicly, that they too had an autistic child and how they were struggling. So there is actually a lot more going on, but we often don't see that. And it's really important to remember that a lot of people from global majority backgrounds will have had to overcome that intergenerational trauma, shame, and stigma. And that's something I'll just kind of talk a little bit more to. So groups of people throughout the ages have been victims of extreme forms of violence, torture, trauma, just for being who they are. And many different ethnic and cultural groups have settled in the UK and in the US and have developed different styles of adaptation to the dominant society. And in an attempt to strive for inclusion in the dominant society, many different ethnic groups have had to give up their ethnic, cultural, family, and spiritual values. And some ethnic and cultural groups have been intentionally stripped of all connection to their roots. And examples, of this are, as you can see, immigration, migration, slavery, colonization, discrimination, racism, oppression, poverty, and sexism. With the exclusion from full participation in society and the impact of these sorts of social and historical traumas, many people find themselves kind of almost on the outside looking in. And, I think whenever I kind of run groups for parents and I talk about this, so many people, I guess they don't see that the imprint of generations of trauma is showing up in how they're processing their own child's autism diagnosis or even their own neurodivergent diagnosis, that this isn't just something that happened to their grandparents, but this is something which is basically like part of the DNA of who they are and what their worldview is like. And it's just really important for us to acknowledge that we are carrying the scars of our past and our histories, and to see that and to see how that's showing up for us in our lives today. So with the exclusion from so I talked about the exclusion from participation in society and the impact of experiencing marginality and social historical trauma is often experienced as the inability, for example, to perform traditional rituals and ceremonies, which are how traditions and values are passed on from one generation to the next. And when this happens, people will often lose, the people, I should say, it can lose its balance and harmony. When the spirit of a people is broken and the trauma is untreated, then often there is some form of reaction, and that reaction can look like, for example, generalized fear, such as a rigidity in the way of people doing things, distrust in oneself, distrust in others, anger that could be turned inwards, anger that's turned outwards, so even in terms of hostility and violence towards others, self-harming, hypersensitivity, fatalism, having a lack of hope, and so many more similar reactions rooted in the historical trauma people experience. And so when you look at that, and then also look at, I guess, the difference in individualist and collectivist culture, and I kind of touched upon this very, very slightly at the very beginning, but it is relevant. So when you look at an individualistic culture, or society, I should say, or in culture, and it's not that all people from one society are individualist, but there are particular, say, countries, we would say, that have individualist cultures within them, such as Western European nations, Canada, US, Australia, and others. But cultures where the value is placed on your personal goals, your achievements, achieving independence, the emphasis on that individual freedom and autonomy, and that focus on making your own choices and being empowered to make those choices without interference from other people. The I element of it, my rights, my desires, what I need to help me, and that's not in a selfish way. It's just in an empowered way. People striving for their own, for personal success and taking their pride in their individual accomplishments, whether that's in sports, academics, careers, or any aspect of your life where you have achieved a level of success. And often, well, not often, in an individualistic society, there is that prioritization of that individual's needs over the collective harmony, and people are encouraged actively to express their individuality. And when you contrast that then with the collectivist culture, where people prioritize the group's goals and needs and harmony, and collectivist cultures are cultures such as some Middle Eastern cultures, some African cultures, maybe China, Japan, maybe some South American cultures where there's an emphasis on that group cohesion and harmony, where you're part of a bigger picture. It's not just you're part of a bigger picture, that decisions that are made will benefit generally the collective, and sometimes that can mean sacrificing personal or individualist desires or preferences, but it's for the greater good, and that there's a shared identity amongst the group, a shared sense of belonging, that there's interdependence on one another, to support one another, to work together, and to avoid conflict proactively. That people make decisions collectively, and there's just a real sense of duty and loyalty to the family, to the community, to the traditions. But what research also shows us is that awareness of autism within a community has got a major impact on the attitudes towards the condition and its characteristics. So in societies where a child's achievements and their behavior are considered to be a reflection of the parents, and that might affect the parents' standing and their reputation in that community, children are almost expected to excel in social etiquette and behavior and activities. And so therefore, for some people from a collectivist culture, having an autistic child can feel like a threat, because they can't then showcase back to the community how good they are as parents, how they are contributing to this collectivist culture in the same way as other parents. And so, there are lots and lots of attitudes and beliefs that will come from home that will directly impact and shape the child's perception of how their autism or their other neurodivergent traits show up, as well as how they tolerate the school environment. And that's not to say that parents are exclusively responsible, but parents are the advocates and the drivers, and they're setting the foundation for their children's success. So some of these considerations are how they and their child are perceived by the wider family and community, which speaks very much to the earlier slide on being part of a collectivist culture. Deference to authority. So in some cultures, it is believed that the professional knows best, the best course of action. And so they won't necessarily feel that they can or are empowered to challenge what a doctor or professional will say. And there are often, therefore, also cross-cultural misunderstandings about the roles as well of those professionals or teachers. People are often, their attitude towards the child's diagnosis can be informed by what their religious beliefs say about disability. For some, it's seen as a challenge that they need to rise up to. And for others, it's almost like a cross that needs to be borne, and that can impact whether or not families will seek support. So it's important to understand this, I guess, as a backdrop to see, I guess, where parents are coming from, and therefore how you can meet them where they're at to give them the support that they need. There are cultural differences and power dynamics between parents and schools, parents and authorities, and so that collaboration is really, really important. Okay, so I am conscious that we're nearly at 8 o'clock, but I will whistle through the next couple of slides. But it's really just to show a couple of examples of how cultural, in terms of cultural presentation, how a child's presentation in one way can mean something culturally, but something very different medically based on the existing models that we're using. So for example, with regards to eye contact, in some cultures, giving direct eye contact is actually considered to be inappropriate, and in other cultures actually rude, especially to people who are older. And I can certainly attest to that. I was not allowed to make eye contact with my father when I was a young girl, as a sign of respect. But actually what we know is that eye contact is one of the many ways in which autism diagnoses are given. It's one of those factors that are considered. Gestures, so in some cultures using an index finger to point is actually considered impolite. And I was certainly taught that pointing was rude and that's not to be done. But actually we also know that the lack of pointing skills is considered to be an early red signal for autism in a number of screening and assessment tools. Regarding speech development, in some African communities, knowledgeable people or those of a higher social class are actually expected to speak less, and therefore limited speech is sometimes considered a sign of higher intelligence or good upbringing, and not as a sign of a communication impairment. And language styles, so using a direct style of communication in some collectivist cultures is considered to be rude or inappropriate. So, in some African countries, communities, it's considered rude to state a belief in the first person, and they might use a third person. But in Western cultures, using indirect language or referring to oneself in the third person is actually associated with communication patterns displayed by some autistic people. Emotional expression. So as an Indian woman, I was certainly told it's not appropriate for females in the house to laugh heartily or in front of older male members of the family. And it doesn't mean that someone's not happy, but that your kind of self-expression is restricted due to the social acceptability of it, depending on the situation that you're in. And so therefore there's not always that transparency in emotional states of children, which is really important to bear in mind when you're interacting with families or individuals from ethnic minority backgrounds. There's some research by Dr. Prithvi Pareppa from the University of Birmingham in the UK, who talks about how some parents from global majority cultures are really reluctant to use alternative methods of communication with their child because of the belief that somehow it would impact their child's ability to develop speech, and especially in communities where there's a tradition of sharing information orally as part of their culture and part of their tradition. And so it's so much more of a bigger deal when you're inviting that parent to not focus on speech as a method of communication, but alternative means. And that can really impact whether or not certain families or individuals engage or not with alternative ways of communicating. And bilingualism, there's research from Peterson and others that found that there was actually no significant difference in the vocabulary development of bilingual Chinese children in their first language and in English. And the study showed that actually, when compared with monolingual children who only spoke English, those who were bilingual had actually larger vocabularies than monolingual children. And so evidence like this can really refute the argument that learning more than one language can be harmful for an autistic child. So I would ask you for your thoughts on the relevance of intersectionality and neurodiversity, but please pop it in the chat, because I just want to close off so that we can actually have a conversation and I can hear your thoughts. So do pop any thoughts you have in the chat for now. So a crucial element, and I can't, this is something we could do a whole other hour on at least, but creating psychological safety, and I've kind of nodded to it a few times in this session today, but creating psychological safety in the home, in our schools, in our societies, in our workplaces is really critical to being able to really harness the true depth, breadth, and talent of autistic people and autistic people from the global majority. And that actually, having that in mind and bearing that in mind really promotes diversity and inclusion. So people who see it as separate, it's not separate from diversity and inclusion, it is very much the kind of root, I would say, of it. So just 3 quick ways of being a culturally responsive ally. So firstly, fostering parent-to-parent connections, or parent-to-school connections, or parent-to-professional connections, whatever those connections are. I guess being cognizant that you don't need to agree with the person's perspective that you're speaking to, but you do need to respect other people's views and perspectives. And actually developing culturally appropriate services has to be an ongoing and continuous process. And being reflective, so us being individually reflective, is the very, very first step of this path. And all of us can look at who is at the table, who is at our work tables, who is at our social tables, and all the other tables that we sit at. We are one person, one being, and we are either consciously inclusive or we're not. So it's a really great point to reflect on. And just a quote from Dr. Parepa from the University of Birmingham around the importance of cultural sensitivity. It's important to be open to new sources of information, challenge our own preconceived notions, and be flexible in how we approach children with autism and their families. And I think that's coming from the perspective that we are not in a society that is equitable. It's already baked in. The inequity, the ableism, the racism, the structural inequality, it's already baked in. So we've got to, I guess, elevate our own consciousness and see that where it shows up, so that we can consciously be part of that journey of turning that narrative around. I do love this quote by Simon Sinek. So if a movement is to have an impact, it has to belong to those who join it and not those who lead it. So autistic voices are central to the success of acceptance, of really harnessing the true depth and power of autism and autistic people. So they're not people to just touch base with. They need to be at the very root and the core. And I feel very much like this forum does that. And it's great to actually say that and be in a space where I feel like we're actually living that right now. So on my final slide. So my 3 wishes, so I've got a little genie lamp there. So I thought I would part with my three things I would like to see. More research, utilizing ethnography that sees people through an intersectional lens. So for example, that sees people's socioeconomic status, the parents' ethnic backgrounds, the individual's ethnic and racialized backgrounds, cultural norms and practices in those communities, and the impact of this on autistic people accessing education, accessing work, and the future opportunities that are available or not to them. having better resources accessible for parents from diverse cultural backgrounds to support their children, and collaboration with faith-based networks so parents don't feel conflicted. Most parents I speak to in this space, wherever I do sessions, whether that's at corporates or parent groups or anywhere else, parents feel conflicted. They feel like their faith spaces are not open to them and their children. And this has got to change, because faith is often plays a very huge part in the cultures of people from those collectivist cultures and backgrounds. So with the resources available to esteemed universities such as yourselves, you're really, really empowered, I see, to take these off my wish list and turn them into reality. And anyone who wants to do that, I'm more than happy to work with you to accomplish that. So that is the end. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm more than happy to take any questions, or if Morgan's got any points in the chat that have come out. So let me end this. And I can actually stop sharing. I hope that was useful.
Brilliant. It was brilliant. I agree with Diane, who just left the comment that it's just one of the best things I've heard. We need this so badly. The statistics are shameful. I've been talking a lot about how autism isn't even what people think it is. The onion layers of trauma that we experience end up as symptoms with this beautiful, hypersensitivity, exquisite sensitivity at the center. And I see that happening to people of color and indigenous populations. I don't want to put anybody down, but Western culture tends to ignore that those onion skin layers have to be peeled away. We've got to go down to the foundation and start over. What I will say is that my dearest hope and my intuitive feeling is that autistic people can communicate with one another and raise, the tide raising all boats. I feel like we have a unique skill where we can be intermediaries for our different cultures and also look towards something new that is shared. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that as a possibility.
I would completely agree. And, I'm just learning all the time. Like, I feel like I know like less than 1%. It's a continuous journey, but I love learning. I love hearing the different perspectives, the different voices. And actually, what you then get is an environment which is not just wholesome or conducive for autistic people, but for everybody. I've, whatever that looks like, whether that's physical adjustments, whether that's other ways of communicating, whatever it is, everyone benefits. And it's good to see that in some organizations, there has been a bit more appreciation of this. But we're looking at very, very small numbers at the moment, and we need to see a lot more. I don't mean to offend anyone, but I am a spiritual person, and my own personal belief is that the autistic people have come to reshape humanity and to remind humanity of their inherent goodness. And I say that to my son all the time. And I say to him, I thank him for helping me find myself, to come back to the self that I am, the self that is actually here to serve, which I didn't see or connect with until I had him.
Thank you. I'm a deeply spiritual person as well, and that's how I see things. And I just love it that we have the opportunity to connect in a world that seems bent on constant dismantling, disconnection. It's time. And so I definitely hope that we work together going forward to make the most of this view.
Was there anything in the chat that I needed to?
Have you worked at all with any deaf neurodiverse individuals?
That's a great question. The only one, and that was about a year ago. It was a different kind of angle though. So she was deaf, and she had a child who was neurodivergent as well. And we were talking more it was more of the parenting side of things around the challenges around communication with her child. But only in that space. But I'm totally open. If I feel like there's something in that, Diane, that is like, would I be open to some conversation around that? And the answer is always yes. So yeah, very limited actually. So that's literally the only direct work I've done was with that one lady. But yeah, if you're thinking something, do share. And if anyone wants to, I very much am a reflector. My best thoughts and ideas never come out in the moment. They're always afterwards. I know it takes me a while to just process things and just to get to, wherever I need to get to in my thinking. So if anyone after this feels like they want to share anything with me, most welcome to email me at hello@reenaanand.com. And I'm sure Dawn and Roger can share my email if anyone wants to, or connect with me on social media and send me a message. I absolutely would be delighted to hear from you with any thoughts or comments or ideas.
Another question we have is, have you written a book?
Not yet. I have written an outline for a book, and I'm currently in talks with a publisher. As I'll find out within a month or so. Then I will certainly share it with Dawn and Roger, and it will take 2 to 3 years anyway. So, but thank you for. I love, and what I've taken away from that question is that someone thinks I should write a book. So I'll take that. So thank you.
I would love to have you come back at your convenience. Like you said several times, we could spend another hour talking about this and that, and absolutely, I agree with you. This has just been wonderful and uplifting, and I would love to have you back to talk some more.
Thank you, Dawn.
I'm so glad this was recorded because it's golden. It's golden. Thank you so much.
Yes, I also want to echo Don's thanks, and I've heard throughout my training and education, some of the best talks you leave with more questions. So this has really been really stimulating in the thought process, and definitely would love to have you back sharing some more knowledge and just for sort of moving this conversation forward.
Happy to. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm very grateful for the invitation.
Yes, let's please keep in touch.
For sure.
Thank you, Reena.